Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Patrick Tucker, Technology Editor for Defense One, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our next session, The Future Cyber Battlefield. In this conversation, we'll be taking a look at cyber as a tool of influence and the future of cyber deterrence, and the role of cyber and even open source intelligence in the future of intelligence, and those conversations, how they're beginning to shape battlefields today and tomorrow. And there's certainly a lot to talk about in terms of both the battlefield of today that we're all watching and witnessing as it evolves, and the battlefield of tomorrow. So joining me, Mike Rogers, Senior Advisor for the Brunswick Group and former Dual Commander, U.S. Cyber Command, and the Director of the National Security Agency, also, of course, retired Admiral. And Dmitri Alperovitch, co-founder, chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, one of the founding members of the cybersecurity company CrowdStrike, very famous for all of the work that it has done identifying cyber actors around the globe, including a few from the Kremlin, but certainly not limited to that. And thank you both for joining us. You've both been, really watching this entire situation play out in Ukraine. And one of the things I wanted to point out and ask you both on, as people that have participated in the act of intelligence collection and intelligence dissemination, watching the U.S. intelligence community over the last month or so, even actually going back to the fall, and the change that's come over the approach to sharing analysis, sharing open source information, but through the guided lens of the intelligence community. It's really been kind of a game changer in the way the international community is talking about what's happening in Ukraine. It's obviously played a huge role in creating diplomatic unity, which maybe it doesn't seem like it's affecting the battlefield right now, but is absolutely affecting the Kremlin and absolutely affects life in Russia. I wonder if both of you could talk really quickly on how the intelligence community now, with that new willingness to share information, to talk about it, kind of compares to the one that both of you in very different ways are used to dealing with. And how else do you see that beginning to change? What other things can the US intelligence community do now to be helpful to this situation in Ukraine? And Admiral, if I can call you Mike.
Sure, please.
I'll start with you.
So first of all, I'd point out, look, this is a shift in policy change. This is not a unilateral decision by intelligence organizations. This is a policy shift at the executive at the White House level, where the administration clearly decided that rather than spend a lot of time debating, was the US information accurate in terms of our warnings, that, hey, it would be better if we were more specific with the specific information and intelligence that we were gaining as a way to potentially both deter, i.e. highlight to the Russians, hey, we have awareness of what you're doing, we're sharing that broadly, but I think also as a way to counter the information dynamic that the Russians have used so well historically, to say, hey, look, here's the things you're going to see. You're going to see provocations that are fabricated. You're going to see the following sorts of activities. I would give them high marks. I think it's been a very effective strategy. I was an advocate in my former life, being much more open and aggressive, because my view was, again, NSA, we're a technical organization. My attitude always was, hey, we gain access, we lose access. That's the nature of our business. Much more difficult challenge to my human teammates, who would always argue, look, remember, there's a human life at the end of this. Who is the source here? We don't want them imprisoned, tortured, their families held. So I give the Biden administration a lot of credit for their willingness to change the policy.
Mm-hmm. Dmitri, let me ask your thoughts on this, because I recall, of course, 2016, when there was a very different, much more limited campaign from the Kremlin to steal information and then use it in a way to manipulate U.S. political discussions. And after CrowdStrike went public with what they had discovered, I would run around, and all of my colleagues in journalism would run around, and we'd try to get some U.S. official on the record. We could get backgrounders for a couple months, and it took weeks, if not longer, for ODNI heads, Clapper in particular, to come out and say, yes, we have absolute high confidence that this is led by the Russian government. And that delay actually had some impact on the credibility of that assessment. And I'm watching now the intelligence community through White House policy move so much more nimbly and presciently. I wonder, like, what are your thoughts on this? Why did it have to take so long for administrations and intelligence communities to learn how to work together on this scale and so quickly?
Well, again, as Mike said, this was a policy shift where the decision was made at the highest levels, of course, to declassify this intelligence. And look, I mean, let's be honest, the stakes are a lot higher. You're talking about a war. You're talking about the largest invasion of Europe in at least over 50 years. So it makes sense that the government, the White House, was going to try to do everything possible to try to prevent it and to try to make sure that the Russians would encounter difficulties. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about the effects that it has had, because I think that we are not fully appreciating the impact of these declassifications. What I think has happened, and remember, it started way back in December when the White House started talking about the fact that President Putin is building this invasion force and he has an intent to invade. And then as we got into January and even February, they started getting very specific. They started talking about the dates of invasion. They started talking about specifics for pretexts that the Russians were going to create to try to have a reason for why they're invading. And I think that had a major effect and profound effect on Putin himself. This is a guy that's always been paranoid. He's not just a KGB guy, as everyone knows, a former KGB guy, but he was KGB counterintelligence, the type of guy that is really trained to see spies and traitors everywhere. And when he's reading in the newspaper that the US government is talking about all of his secret plans, ones that he's already probably limited to a very small entourage that he would talk to, that probably made him even more paranoid and even more secretive and even more restrictive with information about his plans than he would have been otherwise. And we see how that manifested itself on the battlefield, where you had troops going into battle, not knowing that they were going to do it. They thought they were on training exercises, logistics not being prepared for a long battle. The assumptions were completely off because only a few people, probably in the general staff office of the Ministry of Defense, even were aware of this plan and having worked on it. You had the economics people being completely unprepared for the sanctions that were put in place on Russia. As one example, the most severe part of the sanctions was the sanctions on freezing the assets of the Russian central bank, which has over $600 billion in foreign reserves. Half of them were stored overseas in Europe and elsewhere that were frozen. If they were preparing for those sanctions, surely they would have moved them back to Russia or to China, where the US sanctions would not be able to reach them. So just on numerous levels, it was a massive failure. And I think a lot of it can be attributed to the declassification efforts from the government, from the US government, that impacted his calculus.
Now, Patrick, if
Yeah,
I could,
Mike.
it's interesting. This continues. In the last week, you've seen U.S. intelligence disclosure of Russian discussion about biological and chemical. In the last 48 hours, you have seen disclosure of U.S. intelligence sources saying, look, the Russians are approaching the Chinese about military and economic assistance. It's interesting to me that, clearly the policy decision has been, we need to continue this. It's not just associated with deterrence and the buildup to the fight. It's, hey, how do we sustain this over time?
Exactly right. And if you look at the Chinese disclosure that took place over the weekend, that the Russians approached Chinese to potentially purchase some supplies and aid, military aid, that has created enormous pressure on the Chinese publicly, where their foreign minister came out today saying, oh, wait a second, we're not siding with anyone in this conflict, and we're afraid of sanctions, and we're sort of staying neutral. So it is creating enormous effects on both Putin and other parties that may be willing to help Putin. So it's a brilliant use of intelligence. And frankly, I think it is long overdue. I think we've for way too long overclassified our intelligence Because at the end of the day, why are we spending billions upon billions of dollars having an intelligence community? It's not just so people can read reports and find them interesting. It's to act on them, to enable policymakers to make decisions. And unless you're fully utilizing that intelligence to create effects that you want in geopolitics, I don't think you're getting the full value out of it. So I'm very glad to see that we've broken this precedent. And frankly, it seems that despite all of the disclosures over the last few months, our sources continue to remain good. Of course, we don't know if there's been any impact on collection, but at least due to the fact that it continues to take place, even up till now, is an indication that we're still able to collect and still able to act on it. So it in many ways dispels this myth that if you ever publicize something, you're inevitably going to lose sources and methods. And coming back to cyber for a second, this is the argument that I've heard for so many years, going back to late 2000s, when I was doing reports on Chinese espionage and North Korean attacks and others, and doing attribution publicly along with others in the private sector. And the government would not even acknowledge that they could do the attribution, that they had the attribution, that these actors were doing anything. And what I would hear privately from folks in government is them saying, well, we have to protect sources and methods. God forbid we ever disclose that we know the Chinese are hacking. Well, later on, they did start disclosing that. They started doing indictments and outlining all sorts of information that they had on those actors. And guess what? They continue doing that to this day. Yes, in some cases you do lose sources and methods, but it's the job of the intelligence community to ultimately reacquire it and continue collecting. And they seem to be doing a great job of it. So I'm very glad that we're breaking this glass in a major way with this war on this issue.
Mike,
yeah, you've definitely seen a template
to,
for the future. Yeah. I mean, the success that this has generated, this now becomes the norm. This becomes the baseline for the future, I think.
Well, I want to stick with you, Mike, because I want to ask on that. This question of overclassification, it's something that I've seen across the board leaders at the Pentagon, beginning, I think, sort of most publicly with retired Vice Chairman Hyten, but certainly a lot of other folks across the IC. They've gone on Capitol Hill and they've said, we are overclassifying, and they'll watch lawmakers on Capitol Hill turn back to them and say, yes, you're overclassifying, we don't like it. And yet there's been that big kind of barrier right in the middle there between collection and revealing it. And in this instance, it seems like because the issue was of such global importance and you had everyone in the entire world like looking at it, and you also had a lot of stuff that was already in the open source, like everyone was looking at satellite photos of different Russian tank armies driving up to the border and talking about what it meant, then it seemed like it was sort of harder to keep all of that stuff in the box. But Mike, if I could, I want to ask you, what can happen in this process to enable this to be a little bit more of a permanent change? Like obviously tactics, techniques, procedures, sources, and methods, sacrosanct, but is there a middle kind of bureaucracy layer there that gets in the way of this streamlined, strategic, and highly effective use of intelligence? What can be done?
Well, I clearly the fact that we were both able to achieve outcomes and sustain intelligence collection capacity. I mean, I think this situation, as Dmitri has highlighted, shows you, okay, guys, we can do this. Now, it differs a little bit by discipline. As I said, the technical side was a little easier. My argument with the team that I led, NSA, we're the largest intelligence organization in the democratic world. My attitude always was, look, what we need to focus on is less concern about the specifics and more about ask ourselves, can we do this without compromising specific source? I didn't even care about method as much. I was more about, is there something unique in the sourcing? If there's not, my attitude was, guys, let's do this. Now, it's a little different for some other disciplines. I understand that. Part of this, to me, it just shows you culture. The culture of the intelligence world, I was part of it for almost 44 decades, is inherently, look, we need to be very measured. We need to be very protective, because the concern is we want to ensure future access. We want to ensure our ability to provide decision makers, military commanders, policymakers, continued access. And so at times, that idea about the value of sustained continued access tends to be the most immediate shaper of a recommendation about, oh, we shouldn't do this. I'm glad to see that while you consider that, guys, we need to worry about what's the objective we're trying to achieve now. And as Dmitri said, look, we're talking about a major war here.
Mhm.
If you're not going to use intelligence to attempt to deter, put policymakers and operational commanders in a better position, what are you waiting? What are you going to use it for? And so I like to see the fact that argument in the end won out. And my compliments to both the intel world, but to the policymakers who just said, hey, enough, this is what we need to do. Let's go.
Yeah.
You know, just to add to what Mike is saying, I think the culture does play a huge role in this, particularly at the lower levels, because one of the things that I've always encountered in the intelligence community is you have such incredibly smart people with such exquisite access, but they are working in the classified space all day long, oftentimes very long hours, so that when they get home, many of them don't even check the news, don't even check what's going on inside the world, and they're not aware of the value of open source in many cases. I found, it's changing now a little bit, but for a long time, they thought that, if this did not come from a classified source, it was worthless. And they were shocked sometimes what you would be able to discover just looking at open data on the internet. I remember I got a call once with a report that we put out at CrowdStrike about a specific Chinese operation where we actually disclosed people and a lot of things about the organization that was conducting the spying, all based on open source intelligence that we collected. And I got a call from someone in the intelligence community saying, you can't put this out. This is classified information. I'm like, no, it's not. It didn't come from your sources. It came from our sources. So it can't by its nature be classified. But they were just shocked that you would be able to do this out in the open without relying on SIGINT or human sources and so forth. And I think we need to do more to change that culture, to expose people to what the rest of the world looks like, because you're absolutely right, Patrick, when you said the whole invasion preparation was out in the open. It was on TikTok. I was watching videos of movements of armor, all the way from the Far East to the borders of Ukraine. You could count them. You can determine which units were being moved. You didn't need sensitive classified sources to figure out that was happening. Now, you needed that to determine what data the invasion might take place, or the pretext or things of that nature. But a lot of this information is now out in the open, and everyone now generates so much digital exhaust that collection in many ways is becoming easier and easier, at least from a technical perspective.
Although I would point out, what really made this use of intelligence most valuable was the precision. Specific scenarios, the kinds of things. I'm not trying to negate the value of open source, but the best I always thought was, can you bring together the power of the private sector, its capacity, its volume, the fact that, for example, imagery, the technical analysis in cybersecurity firms always like, guys, look at those are great. Those are great insights that provide real value. Can we mesh that with the much smaller, which I acknowledge, unique insights that the classified world gives you? It's the ability to build a complete picture, man. That's the sweet spot for me.
You almost kind of want something that's like the NSA's vulnerability equities process, where there's some sort of tailored access that's created and everyone holds on to it real tight until it's revealed that, oh, it might actually be out in the open, or there's only so long we can keep hold of it. And so, like, my understanding is from Rob Joyce, and maybe my numbers are out of date, but the NSA would declassify about 90% of the things that it would find. Because
during my time, it was 92%.
Yeah.
Declassified 92%.
Yeah. And so that process enables a lot of information in the cyber realm to reach the public. And that it seems like an interesting format for a better understanding of how to talk about open source intelligence with the public, because that's adding that extra level of credibility is something that I, as a journalist, really need, and I think the public understands, and I think it certainly moved the needle here a lot.
Yeah, it is interesting that in some ways, cybersecurity proved to be a much more focused and forward-leaning venue for the dissemination of intelligence generated by the government, than some other areas that we're seeing play out now in Ukraine.
I do have a question for you, Mike, if you don't mind, Patrick, me asking here, but I wonder if you agree with me on this, Mike, that the CIA in many ways, does a better job of promoting their success and talking about them publicly, engaging with Hollywood to create all kinds of movies about what they do, real or imagined, And the agency is just, NSA is just much more insular about talking about that, even though the work that they do is just absolutely amazing on many levels.
I mean, the way I would phrase it is the CIA does a very good job of presenting its capabilities to the outside world. Quite frankly, often with the intent of making the CIA, come out favorably. NSA, historically for us, we were very much, let's focus on the mission, let's generate the maximum value we can, let's worry less about the perceptions. I'm not arguing.
No such agency, right?
Yeah, I'm not arguing one is good or one is bad. It's just a cultural difference historically. And you're seeing that evolve as well, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
I think so.
I wanted to ask you real quick, both of you, a little bit about the cyber dimension of this, because one thing that I've noticed, my email box is certainly clogged with notices from CISA saying we expect to see an increase in Russian cyber activity, and lots of vendors that want to hook me up with an expert that wants to talk about the possible effects of new Russian either ransomware campaigns or attacks on critical infrastructure, cyber physical attacks. Watching what's been going on in Ukraine, you haven't seen any particularly enormous cyber physical attacks, I guess in part because there are a lot of partners that have bolstered Ukrainian defense capabilities, but also they have artillery running around and they can just shoot at whatever they don't like. They don't need to maybe waste a 0 day taking something down. But I wonder if you could both comment on what you see as the future cyber implications of this conflict, both for the United States and within the theater itself.
Dmitri, you kick it off.
Yeah, so I've been very public on a few things about this invasion. One, I was very public back in December predicting they would take place. Unfortunately, I was right on that front. I was also very public in predicting that there would be cyber retaliations in response to the sanctions that we now see being put on Russia, very severe sanctions. Of course, we haven't seen that cyber retaliation just yet. I'm still convinced that it's coming. I think we're in this sort of phony war period that we saw, analogous to the 1939 after the invasion of Poland, but before the invasion of France and the war with Britain in World War II. Where the Russians right now are just preoccupied with Ukraine, right? They're having a hell of a time trying to fight a war in that country, taking a lot of losses. The progress is a lot slower than they would like. So I think at this moment, the last thing that they want is to get into a major escalation with the West, because they're just too focused on that one mission. As soon as they think that things are turning their way, I think they'll look back at, okay, how do we deal with the sanctions situation? And I think they're going to focus on two things. One, they're going to try to divide the alliance. I think they're going to try to hit the Europeans first and foremost, probably their energy sector, to make it even more painful for them from a purchase of oil and gas perspective, hit their storage facilities, hit their LNG ports and so forth. I don't think it will work in terms of pressure, but I think they're going to try. And I think they're also going to retaliate against us, probably against our financial sector, in direct response to the sanctions and the financial costs that the Russian economy is bearing. So I think it's coming. It may not come for a few more months, depending on how the war goes, but I don't think they're going to take this devastation of their economy lying down. I think there's going to be a response, and I think it's going to be severe.
And I would only add, so in the cyber arena, we're looking at two fights to me. The first is Russian cyber activity directed in Ukraine with the express purposes of helping the fight there. There's a lot more activity going on that, quite frankly, is being publicized at the moment. But having said that, I think the Russians held back a little for several reasons. Number one, they fundamentally miscalculated. I thought their calculations were, we're not going to need this. We're going to have such overwhelming capacity and capability on the ground. Number two, I think they believed, look, we don't want to damage this infrastructure because once we move in, we're going to need it. So we don't want to go kinetic against server concentration switching centers. Hey, the injection of massive numbers of malware into the operating infrastructure, hey, we're going to need to use this. We're potentially going to have to clean it up once we move in. And that'll be interesting. Does that change? If they find themselves stalled in the ground, and look, we have to acknowledge they're behind. Personally, for me, I think in the next several days, you're going to see another pivot. They initially tried to insert special forces unmarked elements into the major urban areas to mark targets, to try to break down resistance in the urban areas with the idea that they could then move ground columns straight into the urban areas. Strategy failed miserably. Their forward elements, their advanced element in the cities were rolled up by the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian citizens who noticed activity that just didn't make sense, highlighted it, and most of that was rolled up. The ground elements could not move well. Their logistics, they chose 7 axes of advance simultaneously. They just didn't have the logistics infrastructure to sustain it. So then they pivoted about 3 days into this idea. We're going to start to use more firepower. We're going to see if we can break the will of the citizens of Ukraine. We'll go after apartment buildings. We'll go after the infrastructure. We'll go after people. We're 10 days into that strategy. It has failed miserably. Why they think they can break the will of the men and women of the Ukraine is just beyond me, almost 3 weeks into this. So I wonder if we're going to see a pivot coming up in the next few days, a potentially more widespread destruction. I mean, look, even in Kyiv right now, people are still moving out. You're still doing Zooms. The national leadership is talking to, foreign leaders sustaining this effort in support of Ukraine, seemingly at will. I'm amazed at the amount of information flow, connectivity that the Russians seemingly have left alone. I don't know that that's going to last forever. Then to Dmitri's point, I think the second and the more important becomes, what are the cyber dimensions of the Russian effort outside Ukraine? Because I think increasingly, as the sanctions bite, they're going to be looking for, how do I break, as Dmitri said, how do I break this coalition arrayed against me? How do I cause them economic pain? I need to remind them, you think you can hit me with sanctions? Let me show you what I can do. They're going to want to break the political will of the citizens of these Western nations, show them, hey, we'll show you pain and disruption, pressure your leadership to back off. To do that in the coming months, I expect you're going to see them engaged in cyber activity against government and military targets in the West, against key infrastructure. And then I also think, look for them to target major companies that have left Russia very visibly, have walked away from businesses. Look at them to try to disrupt elements of everyday life, to try to get, a political dynamic, to get people up in arms, to potentially approach their governments. I do agree with Dmitri. We should not draw conclusions from the first, 30 days here. This is going to get much worse, I believe.
One of the things we're tracking with all of this flight of these tech companies like AWS and Microsoft. Microsoft owns GitHub, which is now left. MasterCard and Visa have left. And we're kind of watching the North Koreaization of Russia. How does that affect them as a cyber aggressor? They aren't going to have nearly the same economic ties to the West. And it also seems like, at this point, all of the sanctions buttons have been pressed. So are there any other policy or economic deterrents that might affect their willingness to employ some of those cyber tools?
I'm not sure at this point. I think they're all in and the economy is just getting decimated. And I think more sanctions are going to come as more atrocities are going to be perpetrated by them on the Ukrainian people. I think once they surround Kiev and start leveling that city into the ground, I think you're going to see even more response, potentially even touching on their oil and gas exports, which up till now the Europeans were not willing to touch. There's actually a meme going on in Russia that they need to change the name of the country to further North Korea. So they're appreciating what's coming. But that's exactly why I don't think that the cyber attacks at least are deterrable at this point, because they have really nothing to lose. They're still afraid of a kinetic fight with NATO. And the people that are concerned that, after Ukraine, he's going to roll into Poland or Baltics or what have you, are not paying close enough attention to the ground, because he's committed 75% of his battalion tactical groups to this fight in Ukraine, and he's not making a whole lot of progress there. So you're going to tell me that he's going to turn around and invade NATO when he's already probably incurred at least 10% of casualties in terms of KIAs and wounded of that force? It's just not going to happen. And lots of equipment that's being lost. So he's not looking for a fight with NATO, but cyber is a perfect tool in this gray zone conflict where you're below the threshold of armed force, but you want to inflict pain. And that's why I think he's going to resort to that.
Yeah, I would agree very strongly with Dmitri. He just does not have many tools capable of reaching out and causing impact, breaking the cohesion of this group of nations arrayed against him, breaking the political will. With respect to the companies that are leaving, I agree also with Dmitri strongly. Look, we're going to see more sanctions imposed over time. This is a process that's going to play out over months. And I would also argue, don't minimize how the Russians are going to use relationships that they already have with criminal groups and other entities who offer them additional capacity, additional capability. These patriotic hacker ideas. There's a whole lot of, when you look across the breadth of capability resident within Russia and its associated groups, there's a lot of cyber capacity there that is not going to be undercut by Western technology companies leaving.
Well, in the very little time we have left, because this is now, as you both have forecast on top of many other obviously accurate and prescient forecasts, that this cyber dimension is going to be something that touches our lives as Russia begins to figure out its new normal and turns its attention at Western targets. Can you talk just briefly, in the time we have left, what are some of the policy implications here in the United States in terms of things that Congress can do now to better prepare for that reality, to better make sure that institutions, not just great big companies, but hospitals and schools running old operating systems with buggy, software, even as many entities as we can that are part of our daily life are protected. Just your thoughts on the legislative priorities to deal with this reality that you've both visualized for us.
Well, at Silverado, I'll take this first. At Silverado, we actually put out a list of priorities for 2022 that we offered to both sides of the aisle. We're a bipartisan organization. And the first one is actually, I'm fairly optimistic will get done, and that's the National Incident Reporting legislation, which is long overdue, which mandates reporting to CISA by private sector organizations, particularly in the critical infrastructure space. We absolutely need to give the government visibility into what's going on in the private sector. Let's say there is an attack from Russia on a major critical financial institution. Imagine if they decide not to tell to the government. Imagine if they sweep it under the rug and try to deal with it internally. Maybe they manage to block the intrusion and it hasn't caused much impact. Well, now you have the government not having the visibility into the fact that the Russians are launching their first series of attacks. You don't have them having visibility into what they're doing. They're not able to disseminate that more broadly and help protect the rest of the sector or the rest of the country. So you absolutely need to have that as I think, a critical baseline for what you're going to build on top of this foundation, which is the visibility for the government, for CISA, as well as law enforcement and the intelligence community on the back end, processing that information. And then beyond that, I think there's a variety of things that we can do to help reorganize the government for success, particularly on the civilian side. So NSA has responsibility for protecting the DoD networks. The intelligence community does a good job of protecting their own networks. But on the civilian side, we're still extremely vulnerable. And we have a hodgepodge of agencies that are responsible for their own security. Some do it better than others. And we, I think, really need to invest in CISA, Cybersecurity Information Security Agency. We stood it up a few years ago. We need to actually make it live up to its name and be what I call the CISO of the civilian federal government. Give them the operational authority to actually defend these agencies, particularly the smaller ones that, frankly, will never have the talent, will never have the budgets, the expertise to do what's necessary. You have to start small. So I would advocate for a pilot program where you pick a small agency and let CISA actually become the operational cybersecurity lead for them. But I think that's really important.
And I would agree with everything Dmitri said. I would step back and frame this from a strategic perspective. The U.S. private sector is about to become major targets in a cyber war. It's the first time we've seen this. We've seen, activity for espionage, theft of intellectual property, generation of revenue. We have not seen targets that the goal is damage, degrading, destruction. It's not about generating revenue. It's not about stealing intellectual property. It's not about gaining espionage. It's about generating real effect as part of a broader economic and, as a cyber component to a broader conflict, not competition, conflict. So to me, that means, guys, we need a different approach from the government. And the biggest thing to me that we could do in the short term is we are not going to make major system upgrades in the next 30 days, certainly not at scale. So to me, this all becomes about how can the government collaborate and integrate, particularly in areas of critical infrastructure, with a focus on generating greater resilience. I'm going, guys, we can do that in the near term. It starts with many of the things that Dmitri has outlined. But to me, this is the number one priority for me. If I was back in my old life, would be resilience, resilience, resilience. We're down to some number of days or weeks before this is likely to really kick off. And the dynamic is going to be very different. So this is all about how do we generate and sustain resilience. And to do that, we need a different dynamic between the government and the private sector. And I also agree with Dmitri. Look, we got to start out with a few core areas. I would key on critical infrastructure initially. Remember, the government's defined that already. That's where I would start. And CISA really, as proud as I am to have been the commanding officer of U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency, look, CISA is the primary interface. That's the starting point to me. It always was.
If I can just add on the resilience point, I completely agree with Mike. It's so important. And guess who we can learn a lot from there? It's actually the Ukrainians, because they know how to build networks like that. And in part because of the experience, because their networks have been destroyed so many times by the Russians over the last 8 years, that you kind of learn that as you go. And we need to start thinking about that as well. You know, if it takes us days or weeks to bring things back up online, if there's a destructive event, that's way too long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we're all beginning to see that there's a lot of entities that can move a lot quicker when given the opportunity and the urgency to do so. So we'll just have to
Patrick,
see.
can I make one other comment? It's
Sure.
something Dmitri said that I used to try to remind people. Don't forget resiliency of our society as a whole, over and above cyber. As a society, we have got to be prepared for some degradation, some potential loss of capacity and capability. We don't want it to last days and weeks or months, but we've got to be resilient as a society. You know, look at Israel, look at Ukraine. There's a whole set of examples about how societies continue to function, continue to excel, even in the face of some measure of loss of capabilities, some reduction, some level of friction. We've got to do that as a society too. We don't think or talk much about that.
Yeah. Well, and you know, the job of journalists to go out and help people understand what might befall them, and then they can have expectations that allow them to understand the importance of sacrifices and convenience that they're making. And so just a little plug for journalism there. Anyway, that is all the time we have today. Mike, Dmitri, thank you so much for being here, sharing your insights on what's ahead, sharing your insights on what's happening right now. Thank you to our audience so much for tuning in. Please be sure to stick around for the rest of today's conversations. For Defense One, I'm Patrick Tucker, and we will see you next time.
Thanks.